Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to Season 18 of Your Legislators, where KRWG invites lawmakers to speak in depth about their work in Santa Fe during New Mexico's legislative session. I'm your host, Johnny Coker. Joining me to preview this year's legislative session is Carrie Hamblin, Senator for New Mexico's 38th District. Senator Hamblin, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me. It's so fun to be back in the studios.
Absolutely. So just for viewers that may not know how the legislative session works, I wanted to dive into that, this being the first episode of Season 18. How does New Mexico's legislative session work?
So, you know, as a first-time senator, I'm still learning a lot, but it's a fascinating experiment for me in terms of like human relationships and strategy. And so when we went into the legislative session in 2021, it was completely different than what we experienced in 2023. But what happens during a legislative session is that we will have what are called the reading of the bills. And so this is kind of a basic civics lesson that many people don't know about. What happens is a bill gets drafted, and that's what we're working on at the time we're recording this, and then bills get submitted for the first reading. And the first reading is when the bill is read on the floor of the chamber, in our case, the Senate chamber. That bill gets read in by the Lieutenant Governor, who is the presiding officer of the Senate chambers. In the House, it is the Speaker of the House. And then those bills get assigned to committees. And that's kind of where bills are workshopped. Where you'll get amendments, where there'll be suggestions about changing, where experts get to testify and make the case for the bill. And then once they go through committees, they can pass with a no recommendation, which means the committee doesn't say that the bill needs to have any changes, but they're not going to vote on it. It can be tabled, which means it has to be brought back because it's a bad bill or there's something wrong with the bill, or it gets passed. And so once it gets passed, then it goes to the floor for debate. And if it passes the floor, then it moves to the next chamber to go through a very similar process. Once they pass both chambers, if there are no changes in the mirroring bills, then they go to the governor for signing. But if there are changes, say for example, if a bill gets introduced in the Senate, and then that same bill goes to the House and there are changes to the original bill in the House, then it comes back to the Senate sponsor for what's called concurrence. And that means that the Senate sponsor has to agree to the changes that were created in the House. For example, several years ago, I believe our first session, there was a bill on predatory lending. And Senator Soules was the sponsor of that bill, and that went through the Senate with a 36% APR in comparison to the 175% APR on loans. I don't know if you have a loan for 36%, but not a lot of people do, but that was the compromise. However, it went to the House, and that number got changed to 99%. That if somebody were to take out a payday loan, that they would pay 99% APR. Don't know how many people have that either, and how reasonable that is, which is why there was legislation. However, because of that 99%, Senator Soules didn't agree with that. His intent was to get it to 36%. So we did not concur on that bill, and that bill died. And then it was brought back up again in the following session, and it stayed at 36%. So, you know, that's an example of, you know, sometimes bills don't go through their first time around, and then the process of what happens to a bill.
Mm-hmm. And this session that you're going to this year up in Santa Fe is a 30-day session, so it's going to be very fast and furious. Can you give us, what is the difference between a 60-day and a 30-day session in terms of what is looking at being passed?
Sure. So it's interesting because it's our Constitution that dictates that we either have a 30-day session or a 60-day session. There are several things in our Constitution that need to change. First and foremost is that, because what happens in a 30-day session, it is called a budgetary session. And that means that any items that are addressing the budget or items that the governor wants specifically to be heard. Those are the only types of bills that can be heard during a 30-day session. So for example, I have a healthy food financing initiative that helps small farmers, especially black, brown, and indigenous farmers, women farmers, to get access to low interest loans. That bill will not be able to be heard this time around. So when we have bills like that, also I have a bill that is now currently in executive order where it's counting LGBTQ people in state form. So like if the health department is asking questions about what services are needed, they don't include LGBTQ people. And so how can you determine what services are needed if you're not gathering the data on that community? That data is voluntary. That bill has to wait. We're trying to get a letter from the governor so that she will say, I want that bill on the agenda. But otherwise, what we're seeing is these bills that are kind of more, in my case, I call them social justice bills or bills that impact communities that aren't necessarily budget related. They have to wait 2 years for those bills to come up again if they don't go through. And so that holds people in limbo. And that's not really fair to the residents of New Mexico. But also a 30-day session is the budgetary session. It is fast and furious. Our first couple of days we'll be doing kind of housekeeping and getting committees going. But really the work doesn't start until the second Monday of the session, or the first Monday of the session since we start on a Tuesday. And that's where committees will start meeting, bills will get assigned, and the committees will have access to those bills. So we take the first 3 days of the weekend off so that staff, who is overloaded, because there are hundreds of bills that are introduced every session. And so we want to give staff time to be able to get those bills to each of the committees and get the committee chairs to go ahead and review those and decide where they are on the agenda and so on.
And so, being such a short session, what is your expectation of bills, or what is your expectation of bills that will pass and goals that you have going into the session?
Well, we have quite a bit that is being discussed right now about bills that we want. I know that the governor has talked about having gun legislation be the focus of this session. That's something that she's been working on the entire off session, since we convened this last year. And so I do think that that's going to take up a lot of time. Those types of bills take up a lot of discussion and a lot of debate. And so I think that will be certainly that. Any of the tax issues that we're talking about, one of the big conversations that we're having, though, on both sides of the roundhouse, is how to make sure that we stretch the money that we have in our budget. So, we're a state that our budget is heavily dependent on oil and gas revenues. Well, that's number one, it's a finite resource, but also it's a volatile resource that we know that there are going to be a couple of days, a couple of years, where we're not going to have that money. Right now, we have an abundance of money, and we are in a position of wanting to make sure that we are funding programs so that in about 7 years, those programs don't have to get shut down. Because about 6 years ago, we had that situation where budgets were cut, which means programs were cut throughout the state. We want to try to avoid that. And so there really are a lot of conversations of making sure that we have resources available on the long term so that we don't have to make those painful decisions again of cutting budgets and then therefore programs shutting down. So that's, I think, what we're doing in the 30-day session. Somebody had mentioned to me the other day about a possibility of a special session. The one thing I've learned with politics is that nothing is predictable, so until it actually happens, I'm not going to put a lot of weight into that.
And being, you mentioned oil and gas being such a big part of New Mexico's revenue as a state and essentially keeping the state running and keeping these programs running. How do you, and especially being part of the Senate Conservation Committee, how do you balance that, protecting the environment with also understanding that that is such a pivotal part of New Mexico's income?
Absolutely. Well, our budget goes back to having that relationship with oil and gas goes back to the 1920s. And it was how it was set up that our revenues would come from this industry that was just booming in the state, and especially in the state's early history. And it's not really been to the best of it's not been to our advantage, I think, in the long term when we look at this. Yes, there are programs that we're able to fund. However, we know that this is something that we're not going to be able to depend on every 8 to 10 years. And so we have to kind of scramble. Coming from an economic perspective and being able to wear 2 hats as the CEO of the Green Chamber and then also as a state senator, but I also understand about the needs for jobs. And so I would love for us to move off of oil and gas tomorrow, but the reality is that we're not equipped to do that. I feel our job as a legislature is kind of like a board of directors, and our job is to make sure that communities can do the work that they need to do to make sure that their residents thrive. And there are some parts of the state that are heavily dependent on oil and gas, and that there is no other economy. So our job as a Senate and as a legislature is to make sure that there are jobs available for those folks who are working hard in those jobs. I mean, you can start a job out of high school and make a really good living and support your family. And so when we're talking about removing oil and gas from being dependent on that, they have every right to be scared. And so I feel that our job is to make sure that there are industries available for those folks to get training in those fields to be able to make either equal or more than what they're making now, so that they feel comfortable. And that's a long-term goal and a long-term plan that we can't just do in a year's time. So I hope that my colleagues in the legislature are also recognizing that we need to plan for that, and we need to start setting the infrastructure first and foremost. So the idea of that we should benefit off of renewable energy. We're a state that gets sunshine 350 days out of the year. Why don't we have more of a renewable energy industry in this state, where we can train people, we can manufacture, and we can harness that so that the New Mexicans don't have to pay higher utility bills and can also have good jobs.
Yeah, and I want to go into that a little bit more. Where do you see the oil and gas industry in the next 5 to 10 years, and what kind of legislation would you like to introduce, or have you introduced, in terms of meeting those goals?
My legislation that I introduce is more about economic development and job creation. People who know me know that my values are more conservation and environmentally friendly, but we've got this kind of complex relationship with oil and gas to where we are so dependent on it, and programs that you and I benefit from and that our friends and neighbors benefit from are dependent on those revenues. So I feel that what we have to do in conservation and at the legislature as a whole is be creative and optimistic about these opportunities for renewable energy. So we need to create those jobs. There is a solar plant, a solar panels plant now that is reopening again in Albuquerque, or that one is opening up. There was one that was there several years ago and then wound up closing down. But I know that there's more embracing of renewable energy. And so I think we need to focus on creating more jobs for New Mexicans, not for people from outside of the state, but for New Mexicans to benefit from. And we have to continue to take those steps. And I don't think we're there yet. We're not there yet, but I think we need to continue to move forward for that so that we can make sure that our state thrives. And then when we're dealing with a finite resource, when that goes away, that we are not in a world of hurt.
And switching gears a little bit, earlier you brought up firearms, and that takes up a lot of time. I think it does take up a lot of time, these bills, and a lot of discussion. And you introduced a bill last session that would have raised the minimum age to buy a firearm from 18 to 21. Do you think during this short session that's something that you want to pursue, or is that off the table for now?
I would certainly like to pursue that. And just to clarify, it's that at the age of 18, you can buy an AR-15, but you can't buy a handgun until you're 21. And my bill, I feel, is really kind of the lowest hanging fruit of all of those gun bills, because it's just closing a loophole. And there were a lot of exemptions in that. If you participated in a hunting club, if you were trained, if you were ex-military or ex-law enforcement, it's really, that point of that is to keep those weapons out of the hands of, unfortunately, we are seeing a lot of the mass shootings done by young men from 18 to 21. And so it's to close that loophole, to make that consistent to where if you're buying any firearm, that you are 21 or older. And I do expect that to come up. There are conversations. I haven't had an official word yet from the governor, but I do expect something.
And the governor's public health order that she issued last year definitely brought this issue to the forefront, even more so than it has been in the past. I just wanted to get your thoughts. What are your thoughts on her issuing that public health order that restricted where people could have firearms in public in Bernalillo County?
I'm concerned about the use of a public health order to justify that. I support the governor in making sure that those guns aren't easily accessible. However, I think there are probably more stronger legal routes to make sure that that would happen. And using a public health order opens up the doors for future governors to use that as well for other things. And that I don't think is the most effective way. I think what it ultimately does is show that we are having a crisis, not only in our state, but in our country, of people having access to these high-powered weapons. And I grew up shooting skeet with my father and going to the gun club. I'm not anti-gun. I'm just anti-people who are going to hurt themselves or others having access to those weapons. And I think that's really where we need to continue moving, is that we understand that there are sportsmen who use guns lawfully and safely, and they know what can happen with those weapons. But when we have access to people who are doing it because of either mental illness or because they've got a beef with somebody, that's where we need to put those restrictions in place.
And I know there's a lot of constituents that I've spoken to in my own reporting and also lawmakers that you work with that say any sort of law, well, I don't want to put words in anybody's mouth, but what is your response to those who think that laws that, firearm laws are a violation of the Second Amendment?
I disagree, because we talk about, the Second Amendment talks about a militia, and we can go on and on about the interpretation of the Constitution. And that's where people are using that and their interpretation of what the Constitution meant. However, I think ultimately what we're doing is we're talking about people losing their lives. We're talking about children getting killed. For me, I don't understand why there has to be such a debate when we're talking about people losing their lives because of a weapon that is designed to do mass destruction. That is really a weapon of war, not a weapon for sport or for protection. And so for me, I don't understand why there has to be a continued debate about the Second Amendment when what we're doing is we're talking about people losing their lives.
Okay, well, I want to switch gears because I don't want to stay on this topic because we could have a whole show just on that. But I want to talk about some other committees that you sit on, like you're the vice chair of the Tax, Business, and Transportation Committee. What are some bills that have come before this committee in the past, and what are some that you expect this legislative session?
So this is where the Tax, Business, and Transportation Committee gets really busy during a 30-day budget session, because when we're talking about tax bills or tax credits, those always come before our committee. And there's the omnibus tax package, which is something that still baffles me. I have to admit that taxes give me anxiety. And so I have still quite a bit to learn from Chairman Benny Shendo, who is somebody I have a great deal of respect for. But we'll see stuff about roads, we'll see stuff about taxes, we'll see stuff about businesses. For example, last year, the year before, we had a bill come from one of my colleagues in the Senate, Senator Bill Tallman, who wanted to put a tax on drinks that had different alcohol contents. So if it was 5.9%, this is just as an example, 5.9%, it would be a 3-cent tax increase. If it was 7.9%, it would be a 10-cent tax increase. And that's not the accurate, but just as an example. And I had to actually shoot that bill down because I was like, Senator Tallman, that's a nightmare, a point of sale nightmare for businesses. There needs to be more discussion on that. And so we'll see those kind of bills come before us in the tax committee. What we've talked about in the past is liquor license reform. For many businesses, it's like the taxi medallions in New York City, where like they were rare and you had to wait for one to become available. The same thing happened because of 40 years of tax law that needed to be reformed, because we have these small restaurants that wouldn't have those capabilities of being able to serve local spirits or beers because they didn't have a license. And so now we've been able to reform that to make that a little bit more equitable for our small businesses that can't afford a $500,000 or $750,000 liquor license.
And being a part of that committee, is there any discussion on public transportation? I mean, New Mexico has one of the highest pedestrian fatality rates in the United States, and Doña Ana County is also, pretty rural. So what kind of discussions go on in terms of providing people public transportation and getting those resources into southern New Mexico?
Well, I'm a strong believer in public transportation, and I love that the city of Las Cruces is offering free fares. I was just listening to NPR on the way in on how there is a cap in Washington State that now allows people under 18 to use all public transportation for free. And because of this cap on carbon emissions, that money is going into access to public transportation. We know that if people don't have transportation, that they can't get to work, they can't get to school, they can't get to doctor's appointments. And so there's this inequity there on that. And so I think the more accessible we make public transportation, the better our communities will be, and the fewer struggles that especially people in rural communities will have. You know, we have a situation here where we have the South Central Regional Transit District that David Armijo runs, and he needs all the help he can get. He's doing an incredible job with the services and the buses that he's got, but we have people in the rural parts that are in my district that don't have access to transportation, and so we need to increase that. We need to increase bus lines, and we need to be able to increase those the bus routes that are happening, so that people don't have to wait for a bus at, you know, between 8 and 10 in the morning, and then their next chance is not until 3 or 4 in the afternoon. Mm-hmm. So we need to increase that and put an emphasis on public transportation.
And in terms of helping out New Mexicans in rural areas, you know, last year you sponsored the Healthy Food Financing Act, and food deserts are a big problem, and that also kind of ties into public transportation, being able to get to a place that you can get access to fresh and healthy food. Is that something you plan on revisiting in this session?
Yeah, so a couple of things I want to clarify. So the term food deserts is something that has been in use for a long time, but a friend of mine corrected me on it that actually we have communities that are experiencing food apartheid, because the desert is beautiful to us. And so, yeah, I mean, if you think about it, it makes sense, right? Yeah. So a woman named Karen Washington, who is a black farmer activist, coined that term, and I think that's actually a more appropriate term, is to talk about food apartheid, because we have people who are experiencing food insecurity all over the state, and yet we're not growing enough to feed our own. And so the Healthy Food Financing Initiative is currently underway with the Economic Development Department. They have a woman named Erin, who is the person who facilitates this, and I believe the last time I talked with her, there have been 10 grants that have already been given out throughout the state for the Healthy Food Financing Initiative. So right now it's an agreement. I give junior money to that every year to make sure that they can continue funding that. And then, but we want to make it a law. But what's happening right now is the Economic Development Department at the state level is gathering all of that data, because I will be bringing it up again next session. Should I get reelected, I will be bringing it up again next session, because what we know, even the USDA says this, is that they do not fund, I think it's 74% do not fund Black, brown, and indigenous farmers, and especially women farmers. And yet we have the Anthony Youth Farm that is run by Alma and her crew out there down south that are doing incredible work at not only talking about sustainable farming practices, but that they're also teaching future farmers, because we know that farming is hard, and that farmers are getting older and they're having a hard time finding people to replace them. And yet we need farmers. I don't think we understand how much we need farmers. So I will continue to work with the Economic Development Department, the Food and Food Program. There's like the Double Up Bucks program. Farmers Market is somebody that I get to work with. So we'll continue to bring that up, because it's something that really needs to happen, and we're already seeing people benefit from it.
So you're up in Santa Fe, you'll be up in Santa Fe for this 30-day session. What do your duties look like outside of that period? Because it's such a short session, so as a public official, an elected official, what does your work look like outside of it? What are your plans after the session, essentially?
Well, so I have to work for a living, because, you know, as I talk about that our Constitution needs changing because of the 30 and 60-day sessions, and how we really need to go to a standard, probably 45-day session. The other thing is that we need to modernize our legislature, because I don't get paid for this. I get a stipend. People think that we get paid. We don't. We're the only unpaid legislature in the country, which is problematic in some ways, because either you have to be independently wealthy, retired, or have a job that allows you to take 30 or 60 days off a year. I'm very grateful that I have a job that allows me to take 30 or 60 days off. But I also don't pull a paycheck during that time. So I have a very supportive wife who's like, okay, I'll take care of the bills during this time. That eliminates about 95% of New Mexicans from even considering about running for state office, because they're working 2 or 3 jobs to help support their families. So, you know, to get back around to your question, I was kind of like, I try to use this as an opportunity to educate people about why we need a modernized legislature. I don't have staff except during the legislative session. So when you get my senator card, it's my phone number because I don't have a secretary. And so what you're getting is a part-time legislator. And so what happens when I come back from the legislature is we're able to have a little bit of a break, about 2 months, and then we start the conversation about interim committees. And so if I'm a chair of an interim committee, then I work on planning that. As the vice chair, I'll support Representative Doreen Gallegos, who will be the chair of the Economic and Rural Development and Policy Committee this coming interim.
Carrie Hamblin is Senator for District 38 in Southern New Mexico. Senator Hamblin, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me, Johnny.
That's all for today's show. Be sure and join us next week as we continue our coverage of New Mexico's legislative session. Additionally, you can keep updated on the latest news on our website, krwg.org. For KRWG Public Media, I'm Johnny Coker. We'll see you next time on Your Legislators.